Hi gang, welcome to our lecture on understanding performance. At the end of today's lecture, I would like for you to be able to define criteria, to discuss the difference between conceptual and actual criteria, and the relation to criterion deficiency, criterion relevance, and criterion contamination, terms which we'll all get to be familiar with in just a few minutes. I'd like for you to be able to define work performance and distinguish it from productivity and effectiveness. Then I'd also like for you to be able to describe Campbell's model of performance and its components, but also I'd like for you to be able to define and distinguish task performance from what we call organizational citizenship behaviors and counterproductive work behavior. Up until now, we've been spending our time looking at the land of individual differences. So we've looked at a number of individual difference variables such as emotions, values, intelligence, personality, and interests, and we've learned how these different variables predict performance. But what about the other side of the coin? In addition to looking at individual differences, we also need to look at performance. But first, think about the following question. Why do IO psychologists need to know about work performance? Well, we need to know about work performance in order to answer questions such as these. For example, what does good performance mean for our organization? Who are our best employees? And who are our worst employees? Who should we promote? And, in a nicer way, who should we separate? But we also care about work performance because we want to avoid mistakes such as promoting the wrong people, firing the wrong people, or being sued for employment discrimination. In IO psychology, we use the term criteria or criterion for the singular version to refer to dependent variables or outcomes of interest, but this is more of a technical or research term. Work performance is a common criterion in IO psychology studies. In other words, we're interested in using those individual differences we studied in the last couple of weeks to predict how people will perform on the job. To be used as a criterion, it's necessary to clearly define work performance, then measure it accurately. Once we can measure it accurately, we then try to look at what predicts work performance. And last week, as I just mentioned, and the week before, we talked about all of those individual differences that predicted work performance. So how do we define this criterion of performance? Think of performance as behaviors relevant to the completion of a task and to the organization's goals. It's important, though, to distinguish performance from a number of other different things. So performance is not the consequence of an action. It is the action itself. In addition, performance is not an evaluation about the quality of work, which we refer to as effectiveness. Finally, performance does not take into account the ratio of one's input to their output, which we call productivity. One of the most popular models of performance is one developed by a researcher named Campbell. Let's take a look at this model. Campbell's model first proposes that there are three direct determinants or causes of performance. These three determinants are declarative knowledge, procedural knowledge and skill, and motivation. Declarative knowledge refers to knowledge about facts and things, or an understanding of a task's requirements when you apply it to the job setting. An example of declarative knowledge might be understanding that a guitar is an instrument that has strings and can play music. Procedural knowledge is knowing how to do things. For example, using our guitar illustration, declarative knowledge is knowing what a guitar is, but procedural knowledge would be knowing how to play that guitar. And finally, there's motivation, which refers to choices which individuals make concerning choices to perform, how much effort you will engage in that choice to perform, and finally, how long you will persist at those choices. Campbell also tells us that there are a number of variables that determine performance, but only indirectly through their effects on the direct determinants of declarative knowledge, procedural knowledge, and motivation. And those are all those individual differences on the left-hand side that you see there that we've been studying, except cognitive ability. They affect performance indirectly. So for example, personality, interests, and training experience all affect performance, but only again indirectly through their effects on those direct determinants in the middle. Let's take a look at the components of performance that Campbell proposes. According to Campbell, there are 8 components of performance. They are core tasks, effort, discipline, non-job tasks, communication, peers and team, leadership, and administration. What Campbell wants us to note, though, is that not all components are part of every job. So, for example, Campbell wants us to know that there are 3 that are postulated to be a part of every job. So Campbell asserts that core tasks, effort, and discipline are a important part of performance for every single job, but those other ones are not. And here's what we have when you put the whole model together. But how do we measure performance? We've talked about criteria and how to define it. We've discussed the most popular criterion of work performance in IO psychology by presenting Campbell's model, but now we need to figure out how to measure it. To understand how we measure performance, we need to understand some different terms. Let's start with the ultimate or conceptual criterion. The ultimate or conceptual criterion is an abstract representation of the behaviors, skills, characteristics, and outcomes associated with the job. You can also think of it as representing, quote, the truth or ideal of what we are trying to measure. But remember that when we actually do measure constructs, we never measure things perfectly. And the term that we use for what we actually measure is called the observed criterion. Another important term is what we call criterion relevance. Criterion relevance is the extent to which the observed measure overlaps with the ultimate criterion. So how much of that conceptual criterion are we actually capturing? Contamination, on the other hand, is anything that we measure that is capturing something else other than the conceptual criterion that we are trying to capture. And then criterion deficiency is getting at the fact that what we are actually measuring is somehow deficient in not capturing aspects of that conceptual criterion. Let me give you an example. Let's say that you want to evaluate the claim of a product maker that says they make a health product that contains 100% omega-3 fatty acids. If their claim is true, what percentage of omega fatty acids would be in there? Well, 100%, right? Well, the ultimate criterion is our pie in the sky ideal. It's our actual value or the truth, and that would be 100% in this example. When we measure something, we hope we measure it perfectly, but we never do. But what if they're lying? What if the product makers are lying and the actual amount of omega 3 fatty acids is only 80%, and then 20% of that product is actually ephedrine? The 80% of omega-3 is what we call criterion relevance. Unfortunately, the 20% is contamination, and also we have some, it is also deficient in that way. Another way to look at this is by using student evaluations to measure my performance as a director at the Brazosport College. My job basically is to teach, to supervise other faculty, to oversee tutoring and other roles. However, let's say that we actually only use student evaluations to measure all of these aspects of my job. The relevance comes into play here because some of the student evaluations will capture what I actually do, which is to teach. But these student evaluation ratings are deficient because they don't evaluate all aspects of my job. For example, they wouldn't capture my performance in charge of tutoring. These ratings are also contaminated because students often base their ratings on other criteria and not my actual performance. For example, my ratings could be based on whether they like me or received a grade, a good grade, or poor grade, rather than things like coming to class on time, timely feedback, and my knowledge of the subject matter. Do criteria change over time? Well, yeah, they actually do. The term dynamic criteria captures the fact that this fact and refers to the finding that some aspects of job performance change over time for individuals, and predictors of job performance also change over time. When this happens, we usually have a measurement issue. Let me give you an example. My own job has changed over time. I take on new roles, new responsibilities that were never part of my job description. What this means is that some tests used to select employees will need to be revalidated, or the test may need to be modified. Take a look at the graph below. In this graph, we see 3 different lines that represent the number of accidents, productivity, and absences over time. You can see that these criteria change. So our predictors of these criteria, for example, example, personality tests, cognitive ability tests, or whatever we use will also need to change over time. In this example, cognitive ability might be good in the beginning to predict performance, but as you get better at the job, it might not be as good as a predictor as, for example, conscientiousness is. Job performance criteria can be divided in one of two ways: objective and judgmental. Objective performance criteria are a set of factors used that are relatively objective or factual in nature. For example, you could use production counts, which would be quantitative, or you could look at personnel records and see how many personnel incidents, maybe how many times that they've been late to work, or how many write-ups they've had by a supervisor. Those would be personnel counts. Judgmental performance criteria, on the other hand, are a set of factors that are the product of someone's subjective evaluation of performance quality. A good example of this would be supervisors' performance ratings. Let's take a look at the difference between subjective and objective performance criteria by examining the job of a transportation security officer or airport screener. Objective measures include such things as the number of threats identified, or the speed in which a transportation security officer identifies a threat. But it could also include personnel measures, such as the number of days that they're absent, the number of disciplinary actions taken against them, maybe perhaps the number of awards or the number of promotions they've received. Subjective criteria for a transportation security officer, again, might include supervisor ratings or peer ratings of the transportation security officer. Have any of you guys ever watched the series The Office? You definitely should. It's a great show that illustrates many of the issues we discuss in IO psychology. We can use one of the employees in this show to define performance, Jim Halpert. So, let's start off by asking, what's the goal of the company that Jim Halpert works for, Dunder Mifflin? Well, the goal of this organization is to sell paper, and they do this by using teamwork, using sales, and setting goals. And those are the behaviors that contribute to the completion of that goal. Can we group these behaviors into categories? Well, actually, we can. We have tasks that Jim Halpert needs to perform, and then we have behaviors that we are going to examine pretty soon, such as organizational citizenship behaviors and counterproductive work behaviors. So, summing things up, what is performance? Well, first thing you need to know is that performance is behavioral, and it's an individual's behavior, not at the group level. And we also have to keep in mind that behavior is under the control of individuals. And finally, there are multiple dimensions of behavior as illustrated in Campbell's model, and we'll get more into some other aspects of behavior or performance in just a few minutes. Talk to you soon. Take care.